Psst. Hey you, come here. Yes, you. Yeah, come. Do you want any free materials? I thought you might, and you're in luck because we've just had a massive update to the Community Material Pack, which I announced recently. It's a collection of free CC0 licensed materials, and what that means is you can basically use them for anything, so commercial or non-commercial projects. You can distribute them however you like. So yeah, in this video I thought I'd just tell you about some of the new updates, some of the new materials available. I should probably take off this outfit now because it's a bit warm. Okay, that's much better. So the first material we have is a new procedural marble shader by Chris James Brindley, otherwise known as Chris James CG on Instagram. It's a really cool looking one. It uses volumetrics to get the interior of the marble, and I'm going to show you this in a demonstration scene coming up. We can get all kinds of procedural effects and pretty much use any kind of like three-dimensional generated pattern as the internal volume. It's got some scratches along the surface as well. It looks really nice in reflective scenes. And also there's a little trick: if you use the emission value for the volume, you can get some really cool alien-like effects where you can use it as a creative lighting source. So I really like that one. And there's a variation of this called the Jadeite shader, which has also been added to the pack, which is more for getting, you know, kind of volumetric mineral-like effects, of course inspired by jadeite materials. Then on a more stylistic note, we have these cracked metal tiles by Wilson, who's also another Blender YouTuber. This one's a bit less complex but still quite fun to play around with. You can use it to get all kinds of different tile-like patterns. You can even use it for stone if you wanted. But we do actually have a more advanced tile shader included in this update, and this one comes from Slink. It's just called Cracked Tiles, and this one has a variety of parameters for getting all kinds of like rotational displacement and different cracks along the surface. And I put it to the test recently, making this piece of art, which I also thought would be fun to include as my entry for the current Discord art challenge for emissive lighting. So there's only emissive lights in this scene. But anyway, you can see here how the tiles are coming out of the wall. They're really reflecting the light nicely. If you look closely, they've got the cracks there as well. And you have complete color control over these as well, and scaling control. So like I said, this material is included for free in the Community Material Pack now. That's not the only one that comes from Slink. There's also a knitted cloth pattern, which is more of a demonstration to show how you can get these structured mathematical patterns over a surface. It's more intended for using UV vector coordinates, for example, like the covering for this jar, but you can use generated object coordinates as well for doing procedural material effects if you really wanted. So yeah, that's all the stuff that's included in the new update for the Community Material Pack. You can grab it on Gumroad for free, but now we're going to have a look at some of the demo files I prepared just to show you a visual demonstration of how to use them. And also I should just say I've made a new car paint shader which I've added to the Modular Metals package. I think it's quite pretty. I'm quite proud of how it turned out, but it's just one thing, so it doesn't really warrant its own video, so I'll just let you know here. And before we get into it, all of these demos you're about to see are available on my Patreon for second tier members and above. So if you want to play around with these files for yourself, then you can sign up to that. Alright, now onto the breakdown. So I've got the main art scene here, and I think the magic is lost when I move away from the camera because you can see there's nothing really else going on. If we go into the rendered view, we have it calculating, and because there's just emissive light on these hyper complex surfaces, this takes a lot of time to resolve. But as it does, you can start to see the tiles generated on the wall there, and you'll notice that we're using adaptive subdivision. Now, if you don't know what this is, you might think of it as tessellation if you've been around for a while. I think that term was used mostly in the game industry, where essentially Blender will dynamically add geometry to a surface based on the material properties and how far away it is from the camera. So the rate at which it subdivides the surface is controlled by the dicing scale. You can change this here on the subdivision modifier if you've got the adaptive subdivision enabled, and it'll be different for the viewport and the render. And if we go over to the render settings and then down to subdivision, here you can change the general dicing rate settings for the render and the viewport. So when you have a material like our tiles over here that plugs something into the displacement output of the material output node, this is how you'll know that you can use adaptive subdivision. Another thing to keep in mind is that you won't be able to use that for the Eevee rendering engine. This is only for cycles, and you have to have the experimental feature set selected. Now, why is adaptive subdivision under the experimental setting? No one knows. It's been in the experimental for years and years now. I think it's to do with shame, to be honest. Shame. It's not a perfect system and there are a lot of optimization issues with it, but I think calling a feature experimental kind of prevents you from receiving too much criticism about it. Anyway, when comparing these tiles to the default template, there are a few differences which I've made for this scene. So first of all, they are darker. Let me just press Ctrl B and make a render border here, so we're just looking at the tiles. I'm actually going to hide even more of this just to make it even simpler to render. Okay, so we have our tiles here, and in the shader nodes, you'll see that there's a frame here called color, and it's got a Mix RGB shader inside of it. This is where we control the main color for the nodes. So the first color is going to be the grouting in between the tiles, and the second color is going to be the base tile color. Now these tiles are darker than usual because I am darkening them with the ambient occlusion data, so I can turn that value all the way down. And then maybe let's play with these tiles a bit. So if I change the base color to something more yellow, then we'll see that represented there, but I think the blue is mixing in from the light, which is making it look more green. So if I actually go and click on my emissive light object up here, and if I reset these to a more white color, then we'll get a more accurate representation of the tiles. And now we can continue modifying our color however we like. So if I make the grouting even more white, then we'll get some white outlines there. And this just goes to show with some very quick color changes, you can quite easily change the style of the tiles. Now I've come on over to a more simplified scene where we can actually take a look at these values in a more controlled and high performance setting. So again, we can change the color value there. With the ambient occlusion, this color ramp basically controls the range to which the AO will affect the surface. So if I make this actually all the way black, this color handle, and then if I drag that back and forth, you'll be able to see how it's taking up less and then more of the tile surface. So ambient occlusion, if you don't know, and I've mentioned it so many times in videos, but I'll need to start making like a jar, and every time I mention what ambient occlusion is, I'll put like a pound into it. It basically shadows the object. That's all you need to know. So by plugging the AO value for a color ramp, we can control the range of that shadowing. And then what we're doing is we're darkening the color using a mix RGB mode set to darken, and that gives us the extra shadowing there. If we come on down to the tile angles frame, so that's the middle bottom one here, then there's a value down here called angle strength. If I click on this value, hold shift and then scrub left and right, you can see how we're essentially getting stronger angles for those tiles. And you can put it up to some crazy values if you want. So I think usually you'd keep this on something quite subtle, and this would only really be important if you were using the adaptive subdivision, because that's the only way you would get the depth from these tiles. So if we come on over to the tile cracks frame here, you can see the generated noise textures for creating the crack effects. So you can modify these however you like with the different scale values and to adjust the color ramp as well. So if I move the black color handle all the way to the left, there are more cracks visible. If I bring it closer up to the right, there are fewer cracks visible. So that's quite easy to understand. And then we also have a crack strength value. If I put that on 0, we get nothing. If I put that up to 1, then they are extremely visible. So you have a lot of control over that. You can replace these generated textures with whatever you like. If you wanted to put some custom patterns on those, that's fine. Coming all the way over to the left, there is a general scale value. So if we put that up, it's going to adjust the overall scale for the effect. So you can make these tiles as large or as small as you like. Coming back over to the right, we have the roughness variation frame. So in here we have control for the slightly randomized reflectivity, which you can see as the light is hitting the tile surface there. So if I darken one of these color handles, it's going to be more reflective. Having the darker and the lighter handles here is what gives us that variation between the slightly rough and slightly more smooth surfaces. This is controlled by the noise texture, so if we up the scale on that, it's going to increase the scale of that randomization pattern for the reflectivity. So hopefully that's a good breakdown of that material, and hopefully you can see how versatile it is as well. And like I said, if we disable this subdivision modifier, so if I turn off the adaptive subdivision, this still works perfectly fine as a regular tile material. You absolutely don't need to make use of that adaptive subdivision if you don't want to. So going back to my art file here, if I let this resolve, if you look carefully here, the tiles on the wall have the displacement, but the tiles on the ceiling do not. So that's exactly it. The ceiling has no subdivision, the walls do. So let's move on to the marble material now. So I've got a nice scene here where I have Chris's marble in a bowl of tiles. Now the marble material is fairly complex. Let's just have a quick look at it. There are a few things to keep in mind with the marble material, and one of them is that depending on the scale of the object, you'll need to adjust this volume density multiplier. And he's giving us some references here. So 0.01 meters would be about 10,000 value, 0.1 for 1,000, 1 meter 100, 10 meters 10. So you can adjust this as you feel is appropriate. I think this marble is roughly around the 1 meter scale, so that's why it's set to 100. To actually change the pattern, if I just zoom in there, we have the color and pattern frame, and the thing you want to pay attention to is the color glass density. So if I adjust the black color handle on this, as I bring it to the left, we have just the strongest elements of that generated pattern, and then if I bring it back to the right, we can then make it denser. Now the pattern for this is actually created by this marbling control node group. So there's a bunch of stuff in here you can take a look at, and there's generated textures. Again, you can replace these with whatever you like. But going back out, the two values you want to pay attention to are the offset and the scale, although you do have the other control here as well. But these are the ones which are going to get you like immediate changes for the effect. So as I scrub the offset, it's going to change the position of that pattern pretty much in the 3-dimensional space. Same thing for scale as well. We can bring the scale up to make the pattern higher frequency and bring it down to give it a lower frequency. The color can also be controlled here, so we can replace this again with anything we like to get a bit creative. So there you go. Let me reset those. But I think playing with the density is one of the funner elements. And again, because this effect is controlled by the volume, it means that there is actual physical presence inside the object. So if you went inside, you would actually be able to kind of fly around the volumes a bit. It would be very confusing and very noisy, but it just goes to show this is not just a surface effect. And if I rotate the sphere around, you can actually kind of see this. Maybe let me turn on the denoising. So as I rotate it around, you can get a sense of depth for what's inside of the object. Down in the scratch is a normal frame. This is where these scratches are generated over the surface. It's quite a nice effect. And I think it's quite self-explanatory. Again, you can modify these for whatever you like. That's one of the fun things about material nodes in Blender. Every parameter is modifiable, and the term for that is parametric. And we can see that the way this material is composed is by combining a principled BSDF shader for the actual surface and a principled volume shader for the interior effect. These are mixed together like so, and though I wouldn't recommend it, you can play with some of the values here to adjust like the shadowing and how it affects like the inside of the object, and maybe you want to use that for artistic effect, but I would just leave that as it is. But an interesting thing you can do is come down to the principled volume shader, and there are a bunch of other parameters on here that aren't really utilized, and one of those is the emission strength. So if you want, you can play with that and turn this into a creative lighting source, and I think there's cool opportunity to create all kinds of weird alien effects with this. So one thing I would have in mind is I think this would be cool for like some kind of creature eye, where we can take the marbling pattern and use it almost as like some kind of weird iris thing to come down, but to have the eye kind of glowing. Does that make sense? Might sound a bit weird, but I might want to experiment with that one day. The marble is again not the only shader that Chris has given us. He also gave us the jadeite shader, which is quite nice. Again, it's using the volume technique, but it takes a little while to resolve the calculation for this because there's a lot of volume data going on. But this is obviously more for simulating jadeite mineral type visuals. I think it would look good on statues and stuff like that, but again, you'd have to adjust the volume density multiplier. But again, like with these color ramps, we can adjust the density manually as well. So if you want to make it kind of more see-through or darker and thicker, then you can do that as well. Alright, so I've come over to the actual community material pack file. This one should resolve faster, but there's some extra stuff in here that I can show. So first of all, we had the knitted pattern by Slink. Quite a complex material, but you can have a look at it and see how to compose these patterns and put them together. There's the checker color and cloth color, which is your like obvious control for how to change how this looks. So you can play around with those values. Also, this is more intended for using the UV texture coordinates, but you can use the object and generated ones as well if you like, but obviously the pattern's not going to be exactly the same. So if you want to wrap it around an object properly, then you need to UV map the object. But you can play around with these however you like and kind of adjust the, the rotational values if you wanted to do that to get like different effects. That kind of starts looking like the Target logo there. If you zoom in on this as well, you'll notice that there is a kind of bumpy surface going on, and that's generated by this knitted bump pattern frame. So that's giving us the kind of more high frequency effect there. And the checker pattern itself is just generated by this top frame here called checker pattern. And we've tried to set up the different appropriate values here in these nodes. So you can adjust the thickness of the pattern, so you can make it very small if you like, or adjust the balance so we can make it more faded. But it does more than that, because if you go really low and then into the negative, then you can get these kind of square blocks in between the checker pattern. So there's actually quite a lot you can do with this if you play around with the values. So let me try making that black and see, we're making something completely different now. Yeah, kind of red, a bit more menacing. So this looks very different to the original material now, and we've still got that lovely bump effect going on over the surface. I actually really like how that looks. Maybe let me put a brushed metal pattern on the jar, and now it's like it's a tin. It's a tin with a black and red knitted pattern around it. So you can see how easy it is to, modify these materials and just make some new stuff with them. We also had the cracked metal tiles by Wilson. This one is again more of like a kind of stylistic fun effect, and you can use it to get all kinds of interesting stuff. So there's free generated textures here which you can modify to change how the pattern looks with their associated color ramps. And it also plugs into the bump of the shader as well. And again, you can use adaptive subdivision for the displacement on this, which we're not doing, but you can do if you wanted. So again, adjust these as you see fit. Let's see, now we have some kind of weird crocodile skin. So yeah, that's a demonstration of what's available to you. Remember, again, you can play with some of these demo files, in particular the art one I've made, if you sign up to the second tier of the Patreon. You can download the community material pack for free on Gumroad or for $1 on Blender Market. And you can check out my other tools, products, and resources on curtisholt.online/store. Otherwise, feel free to check out the other videos on this channel if you want to learn more about Blender, how to improve your artwork, and just see what other stuff we're working on. So if you made it this far, the emojis for this video is going to be 2 glasses chinking together. So you can either do the champagne ones or the beer ones, any of that's appropriate. And I think the reason for that is because this is a community effort, so we're kind of cheersing each other to the progress being made. So if you put that emoji down below, I'll be able to see who made it this far through the video. Also, feel free to check out my second channel if you like more kind of conversational content or just want some more content in general. It's usually less heavily edited and we just talk about random stuff on there. So yeah, otherwise, have a fantastic day. I'm going to get back to trying to be productive and just making you more cool stuff. So yeah, thanks for watching, have a great day, and I will see you next time.